Hello, welcome to Cat 109, the history, politics, and ethics of the cannabis industry. Today we're doing an introduction to ethics, so it's going to be heavy on ethics, light on the cannabis. Take that as your warning. So let's talk about what philosophy actually is, because ethics is part of that concept of philosophy. Philosophy is the study of the nature of knowledge. It is concerned with questions of how should a person behave or act. Those are the ethics. What is the essential nature of things? That is metaphysics. What does doing something correctly even mean? Otherwise known as metaethics. Why is something considered a good thing? We don't know. That's the whole concept of why some things are considered good and some things are considered bad. What are the correct principles of reasoning or logic? So ultimately, it is the search for knowledge and truth, especially about the nature of man and his behavior and beliefs. And that is from the Kerneman English Multilingual Dictionary. Say that 3 times fast. Ethics, or moral philosophy, focuses on how people should act as well as how to define what is correct conduct. Now, this relates to cannabis in a lot of different ways, because for years and years and years and years, we've been told that people who smoke cannabis or, make brownies, whatever, are bad people. But is the act itself bad, or did society turn it into something that they define as bad? And that's why ethics are so important to understand, especially in relation to the cannabis industry. So the study of ethics and philosophy teaches us different ways, aka methods, to analyze moral dilemmas and social problems. So this presentation is more of an overview of traditional philosophical frameworks. So when we are talking about any kind of philosophical question, you have to bring to it a certain level of organization. How do you organize your perspective? And what these philosophers that we're going to talk about do is they have a system that whenever they're faced with a dilemma, go to the system and it helps them make the right for them decision. And theoretically, that could also help for your decision making. So let's talk about the term cultural norm. And those are the rules that govern social behavior. So what is normal in one country may not be normal in another. So, for example, women in Saudi Arabia are expected to always wear a burqa when they are in public. Whereas in the United States, pretty much anything goes. You do see women walking around in burqas, but you also see men and women walking around in short shorts and tank tops and, wearing Birkenstocks, which really are just a crime against nature. No, kidding, love them. Ethics rely on meta-norms. These are universal guidelines that tell people to punish the transgressors of norms. So, for example, corruption must be punished, i.e. the police, the government, otherwise everyone will do it. And we're in a very interesting situation right now in 2020 because corruption has become endemic in the political system, with money being the way people get elected. So, there's a lot of meta norms that transition over time, and that's going to be a very important element in this whole conversation. So, what is the point of norms? Philosophically, the idea of societal norms allow man and womankind to flourish and achieve our full potential. Think of it as a race where everyone starts at the same spot, instead of one runner being 20 feet ahead or behind the other runners. Ethics and norms are there to try and make things fair. And although fair is not always the most appropriate term to use because life is not fair, we want to try and make things equal or at least equitable for people. This toilet example I have over here of the yes and no, there are certain countries you go to and the toilet is a hole in the wall, and that squatting position that you see where it says X no, that's the way to go. So, again, norms in the United States, for example, are going to differ from norms in other countries. Do norms work? Yeah, mostly. But there are always people who want to undermine the rules to achieve their goals without the thought to the needs of others. So somebody like Bernie Madoff, who stole billions of dollars from people, he could have done it the right way. He was a Wall Street banking guy. He knew how to make money legally, but he could make a lot of money illegally. The fact that he ruined thousands of people's lives, that's nothing. But again, it is something, because that's what society says is good and bad. So when we're looking at these norms, we also have to think about the ethics, which are the standards that distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. Most people learn our ethical norms at home, at school, in church, and in other social settings. They're usually learned as to what is right and what is wrong during childhood. Now, we learn you're not supposed to hit your brother. We learn you're not supposed to hit the cat. We learn that you're not supposed to curse in front of your grandma. Things like that. So we learn these things, and we're not even really conscious of having to learn them, because we started learning them from a very young age when we were babies, and we were told not to pull the cat's tail. The thing is that if your family comes from a particular perspective, you're going to learn right and wrong based on things that don't necessarily agree with society. For example, if you grow up in a household that's very racist and you learn that a certain racial group or a religious group are bad people, that's going to be your norm. And when you get out into the real world, you find out that not everybody agrees with you. So ethical norms have become so ubiquitous that one might be tempted to regard them as common sense. On the other hand, if morality were nothing more than common sense, then why are there so many ethical disputes and issues in our society? So, what we might consider as something that's so normal, don't steal, may not be normal to somebody else. We as a society have decided these norms, but there's always going to be individuals who we call the outliers, who don't believe in these rules, who don't share the same ethical norms. So let's talk about the master principle of morality. There are the choices that should always be open to the fulfillment of persons and communities. So examples of good uses of regulatory codes, for example, we have blocking software to prevent young children from seeing pornography. So what we're looking at here is we want people to have choices, but we also want people to be protected. So morality is a combination of protection and opportunity. The ultimate human good would be humans flourishing. So again, safety is going to be part of that, and then the other part of that is developing opportunities. So this should define the basis for how we create our laws, how we develop our social institutions, and how we regulate the internet. The internet is such a major part of all of our lives. We interact with it almost on an hourly basis. Therefore, it has become one of the most important aspects of any kind of moral or ethical or social norm. Here's a little word for you for the day: hegemonia. It is human flourishing, a contented state of being happy, healthy, and prosperous. And that ultimately is what philosophers believe we should all achieve and attain. So we're going to talk about these 6 ethical philosophies: utilitarianism, social contract theory, pluralism, and the categorical imperative, cocktail party word, virtue ethics, ethical egoism, and the new natural law. I picked 6 that I thought really kind of covered modern society, ancient society, all of our ethical conundrums, and depending on your point of view, one of these may speak to you, and you can pursue it as a decision-making opportunity. So let's start with utilitarianism. This was developed by Jeremy Bentham in the late 1700s, early 1800s. He's the top picture, very handsome fella. And John Stuart Mill in the mid 1800s, and he's the guy on the bottom with the weird lump on his head. Utilitarianism believes that the purpose of morality is to make life better by increasing the amount of good things, such as pleasure and happiness, in the world, and decreasing the amount of bad things, such as pain and unhappiness in the world. Seems like a good deal, right? The best action is one that has the greatest possible balance of good over bad for the greatest number of people. So basically, democracy in a nutshell, majority rule. Bentham and Mill said that no action is good or evil in and of itself, but the results of those actions are the only things that matter. So again, just to kind of put this in the nutshell, what you do doesn't matter. How it affects others is what matters. Now, the downside to utilitarianism is what happens when human rights conflict with utility. So, for example, the National Security Agency, a government agency in the United States, was found to be accessing our online info to monitor all citizens for possible terrorist activity. So our right as Americans to privacy, is it okay to suppress it for the common good? This theory lacks sensitivity to the ideas of justice and human rights. So utilitarianism is great if you live in an authoritarian country, like China, but you don't have a lot of human rights. You don't have your own sense of right. So another example. Imagine a married man on a business trip in a distant town. He meets a woman also married, and they instantly feel a lustful attraction to each other. Knowing that they'll never be found out, they embark on a passionate affair for the 3 days they're together. According to utilitarian ethics, they have done nothing wrong. On the contrary, it would be morally wrong for them to not sleep together because one would be denying the other pleasure. So, basically utilitarianism also allows that you can commit all kinds of moral indiscretions as long as nobody finds out. So, you're walking a very fine line as to morals, ethics, and whether or not there should be some sense of social responsibility. Next, we're moving on to the social contract philosophy. I'm a big fan of this one, so fair warning. It examines moral issues from the perspective of the human rights that may be at stake. A right is something a population is entitled to. So the rights of health and freedom and privacy and free speech, free practice of religion, all of those in the United States are considered our rights. The consequences of an action are morally irrelevant, as opposed to utilitarianism. So for social contract philosophy, if the consequences of whatever you're doing are irrelevant because the action itself is what you have to decide if it's a moral choice or an immoral choice. Negative right, one is free from external interference in one's affairs. So the right of privacy, for example. A positive right, one must be provided with something to pursue one's legitimate interests. For example, public education. Your 5-year-old starts kindergarten. That's considered a right in this country. Not all countries. The philosophers John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Rawls believe we have basic rights because an implicit social contract between the individual and the civilized society in which we live. We are guaranteed certain rights, life and liberty, in exchange for following laws and regulations of society. So, in a sense, it is a massive quid pro quo. We agree to behave a certain way in order to get the benefits of living in a society. So, is it a perfect system? No. But the idea of this social contract, and you can take it down to even a micro level in the sense that, if we had really good parents who took care of us and made sure that we always had some, food and clothing and health care and all that stuff, social contract would say that when they get old, we as children who were well looked after have a social contract right and responsibility to look after them as they age and become feeble. So, in a sense, it is that I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back for life, so that all of us can get along. The answers are not always so clear-cut in the world. For example, the person who sends spam claims that they are exercising their free speech, but the person who receives the spam can claim that their right of privacy is being trespassed against. We all open our email, and there's 1,700 emails of crap we never want. And there's always a few emails then of, we can enlarge your penis, or you can get all kinds of drugs for cheap. Those are the spam. And again, it's an irritation in our lives. If we had to pay for receiving emails, spam would disappear tomorrow. So, we have to think about how these social contract issues exist. Access to healthcare is recognized as an essential part of the social contract between citizens and leaders of a government, ensuring a sound and healthy society. So, if you go to a country like Sweden, Norway, China, Russia, you get sick, you go to the doctors, it's not going to be, you have to pay before we do anything. In the United States, access to healthcare is tied to insurance and money, meaning the best healthcare is tied to having the most money. Those with the least money have the least access to good healthcare. So the social contract is telling us, look, the United States does not value the health and well-being of its citizens if they do not provide affordable healthcare. The conversations that go around this is, well, if your job doesn't offer it, change your job. Well, not everybody has the academic ability to improve themselves to get that job that has great healthcare. So, when we look at these social contract problems, there's always going to be problems with every philosophy, but you have to find the one that you feel works best for you. Moving on to a little Immanuel Kant. There's that handsome fella on the right. His concept was called pluralism, or your moral duty. Based on the moral philosopher Immanuel Kant, one should always strive to identify and carry out one's moral duty. Consequences of an action are morally irrelevant, and the results from our actions can never be taken into consideration. So here's another one who's saying, what happens when we do our moral act? It doesn't matter. The consequences are irrelevant. It's all about the act we take ourselves. Moral worth is defined by our duty, or moral duty. According to Kant, our moral duty is defined by rational moral law that is universal. For example, you find a credit card on the street, and instead of using it at your local electronics store to engage in a little fraud, you turn it into the police. The moral duty is based on the idea that stealing is wrong. So we have to think about what our duties are, thinking about Immanuel Kant and pluralism. It's also been called the categorical imperative, the obligation to do one's duty for its own sake and not in pursuit of further ends. No exceptions. This imperative is true at all times and in all situations. So, for example, there are instances where somebody is dying of cancer and they're desperate to end their own lives. And the person who would follow this pluralistic idea would say, I don't care how much pain you're in, I cannot take your life. It is my moral stance that killing is wrong, even if it's a mercy killing. So Kant believed we had perfect duties. Duties we are always obliged to follow, such as telling the truth or keeping a promise. It is similar to the principle of fair play. We should never make an exception for our own gain. And again, what we end up here with is this idea of the circumstances are not important. It is what is your moral duty, and the consequences are equally unimportant. So, as you can imagine, there are limitations to pluralism. It is accepted that Kant's philosophy is too rigid because it doesn't allow for acting towards the greater good. So, for example, we know it's wrong to lie, but what if lying would save somebody's life? According to Kant, the moral duty is to not lie. William D. Ross attempted to soften Kant's inflexibility by proposing that our duties are conditional and not absolute, meaning his duties conflict with one another. One duty can supersede another duty if it is judged to be superior. He emphasizes that one duty cannot be overridden for selfish purposes. So, for example, it's getting back to our lying to save someone's life. The duty to save someone's life and to preserve life is significantly higher than to avoid lying. So what Ross is saying is when duties conflict, you take the higher level duty. So now we're moving on to virtue ethics, another philosophical framework that I find especially appealing. This ethical framework emphasizes a person's character and their ability to foster certain virtues, as well as having practical wisdom. Now, this is a really old philosophy. It was developed by Aristotle around 384 to 322 BCE, so we're going to say 350 BCE. So we're looking at a philosophy that's almost 2,500 years old. He focused on specific virtues that he felt led people to make good ethical choices. The virtues he spread included honesty, bravery, and generosity. So those are the three characteristics that he prized above all others. Modern-day virtue ethics have three aspects. Hegemonianism, which is that fancy word we talked about, which is the human flourishing, is equated with performing one's distinctive function well. In other words, being the best you can be. Agent-based theories emphasize that virtues are determined by common sense intuition that we judge to be admirable traits in other people. So, some people see leadership as a great virtue. Other people see, that willingness to take risks as a virtue. Other people may see stability as a virtue. Then there are the ethics of care, which is proposed by feminist philosophers who challenge the idea that ethics should focus solely on justice and bravery. It argues that more feminine traits, such as caring and nurturing, should also be considered. And, for those of you who may roll your eyes when you hear the word feminist, think about it from this perspective. For thousands of years, we have used masculine virtues as universal virtues. What's wrong with some of the feminine virtues, such as nurturing, caring, consideration, being empathetic? So again, just kind of calm yourself down if you have eye-rolling tendencies, but think about it from the perspective of what happens in the society when female traits become more important. Not more important than male traits, but just more important. So, the limitations of virtue ethics. Different people, different cultures, and different societies have very different opinions of what constitutes a virtue. So, in this country, Liberty is so important to American ideals. You go to a country like China, liberty is something that is foreign to them. Independent thinking in the United States, very important. You go to other countries, independent thinking is frowned upon. Japan, it's all about that group consensus. So when we think of virtue ethics, we have to think of it from a cultural perspective. And we talked about culture and how culture evolves and changes. So, again, virtue ethics change over time, but there's also that change between cultures. So it does not focus on what sorts of actions are morally permitted and which ones are not, but rather on what sort of quality someone ought to foster in order to become a good person. So we have a little comic here, and if you don't know Calvin and Hobbes, it's brilliant. So, the tiger says, "How are you doing on your New Year's resolutions?" And Calvin, the young boy, says, "I didn't make any." And Calvin says, continuing, "See, in order to improve oneself, one must have some idea of what's good that implies certain values. But as we all know, values are relative. Every system of belief is equally valid, and we need to tolerate diversity. Virtue isn't better than vice, it's just different." And then the tiger says, "I don't know if I can tolerate that much tolerance." And Calvin finishes with, "I refuse to be victimized by notions of virtuous behavior." So, just to kind of put this into context, when virtue ethics has made it to the comic strips, it has some long-lasting appeal. So now we're going to talk about a philosophical perspective that gained notoriety in the early part of the 20th century and had a brief comeback at the early part of the 21st century, but seems to be fading again. This is called ethical egoism, and it defines the pursuit of self-interest as a moral good. What is good for one's survival and personal happiness is moral. This was originally developed by Henry Sidgwick in 1874, who saw ethical egoism as a personal version of utilitarianism. Adam Smith, who was an economic philosophy of capitalism, in case you've heard of him, promoted this concept, arguing that pursuing one's personal good would lead to prosperous nations. Now, there's some problems with ethical egoism. You don't recognize other people's rights. It violates the basic tenets of an ethical system and supports exploitive actions by strong against the weak. So if you're a Nazi, this is a great idea. If you're not a Nazi, probably not. Now, in the mid-20th century, the writer Ayn Rand, who wrote Atlas Shrugged, among other terrible books, promoted a similar idea to ethical egoism called objectivism, which is defined as the commitment to gaining and maintaining one's own value. For example, while productivity and pride can be seen as virtues, characteristics such as kindness, generosity, and forgiveness are not, because they do not contribute to a person's ultimate value. From this perspective, a person would not risk their life to help someone else. Our only obligation is to ourselves. Much of Ayn Rand's philosophies are aligned with today's Libertarian political party, which, as I said, kind of gained a little traction about 10 years ago, but has since faded into the background as Donald Trump's cult of personality has taken over, and they don't necessarily read the philosophy of Ayn Rand. So, limitations of ethical egoism. Personal relationships could not be sustained. If people only focused on their own benefits, there would not be any consideration or cooperation, which are key elements in a personal relationship. Society would have never come together if everybody was out for just themselves. To live in any society, you need cooperation, and you need to be able to work with other people. It would eliminate objective decision-making. If a person's interests drove every decision, no one would care how others saw them. The philosophy requires that everyone follows this path. Everyone must act in their own self-interest. This would require people with deeply religious or spiritual feelings to set them aside to focus solely on their own fulfillment. And again, many of us may come from a place where we want the world as a whole to be a better place, not just our tiny piece of it. So finally, we have what's known as New Natural Law, developed by John Finnis and Germaine Gris, based on the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. First principle, good should be done and evil should be avoided. I know that's kind of a duh, but the imperatives are avoid acting out of hostility, that's a great piece of advice, because when we're angry, we say and do things we really regret. Avoid seeking vengeance. Some people, we love the idea of vengeance. We stay awake at night thinking how we'll get vengeance. But ultimately, what does it do? It just hurts somebody else. And never choose evil to achieve a good end. You need money to help your mom save her life for an operation. Robbing a bank or killing people is not the best way to do that. The main criticism of New Natural Law is that these imperatives are often in direct opposition to the practical and legal issues being addressed. So, for example, the death penalty. We are terminating a person's life, the government is, because they terminated somebody's life. So again, there's all kinds of conflicts in all of these moral dilemmas. But hopefully, between these 6 different ideas, you found a moral system that you might be able to apply to your own life to help you make those hard decisions. If you have any questions, please text me or email me. If you're not in my class, leave me a comment and I will be happy to get back to you. Thank you and have a fabulous day.